Europe is sweltering under one of its earliest and hottest heat waves on record. Scientists say climate change is driving unseasonably high temperatures.
Europe is in the grip of a fierce heat wave, with many countries across the continent experiencing record temperatures. Wildfires are burning in different parts of the continent, including in France, Spain, Italy, Portugal, Croatia and Greece. They're also burning in Morocco, in North Africa. In France, the authorities are warning of a heat apocalypse. We know many towns and cities have recorded their highest ever temperatures. That shows the region. You can see smoke is clearly visible from space. We know thousands of firefighters are now battling these fires, and more than 14,000 hectares of forest have already been damaged. As well as that, over 20,000 people have been evacuated, and that figure is expected to rise.
Japan, meanwhile, has been reeling under the worst heat wave that the country has seen since 1875. Hundreds of people were treated for heat strokes as the temperatures in Tokyo broke nearly 150-year records for the month of June. Meanwhile, China has also issued a yellow alert for high temperatures and heat waves in various parts of the country.
In 2021, the United Nations hosted the COP26 summit in Glasgow. The purpose was to bring countries together to accelerate action towards the goals of the Paris Agreement and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Scientific evidence presented by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, on global warming was explicitly used in the Glasgow Climate Pact, including the realization that climate change's adverse impacts on people will continue with rising temperatures. However, geopolitical realities mean that developing countries are treated as less equal than the developed. Therefore, how do these international agreements make a difference to countries that are smaller or considered less powerful? How do we make sense of the international climate change regime, given that these countries ultimately bear the most impact of climate disasters? In our second episode on breaking down the essentials around climate change, I am joined by two experts. Professor Philippe Cullet from the SOAS University of London, who works on natural resource allocation and international governance around climate change, as well as Dr. Roopa Madhav at the National Law University, Delhi, who has written extensively on water laws through the lens of the informal sector, agriculture and trade. But before we go any further, just a quick reminder to our listeners. This series is produced as a part of the broader academic collaboration between the National Law University, Delhi and the SOAS University of London. The idea is to form a deeper understanding of climate justice and climate law, particularly from the perspectives of the Global South. In this 3-episode podcast series, we speak to the leading academics from the UK and India who will help us understand the meaning of climate justice, the impact of colonialism on climate change, the international climate change regime, and why the intersection between climate change and human rights deserves to be spotlighted. Join me, your host Kunal Purohit, in this 3-part episode series as I unpack these questions and more. This is the second in a series of 3 episodes. I start off with the basics, asking them just what is climate justice and why we must care about it. One of the first things that, as we'd also discussed, I really wanted to get to the bottom of when we start off, is that this is happening in the backdrop of heat waves globally. We've seen that in China, we've seen that in South Asia, we've seen that in Europe, the UK, the US, everywhere. We're now also seeing increasing amount of studies being done about the fact that these heat waves have happened. They will be a lot more frequent. Volcanic eruptions are going to be a lot more frequent as well. So in a way, we're already seeing some very catastrophic sort of impacts that climate change is having in our lives right now. We're hurtling in some ways towards a climate emergency. At this particular time, why is climate justice such an important concept to be understood and to be reiterated? And what really is climate justice?
Okay, fine. Then, as an entry point into the discussion, maybe one way to put it is that the discussions around climate change have focused a lot on the global picture, which we need to do, whether it's a global changing weather patterns, the kind of severe weather events we are all suffering from increasingly. Okay, obviously some parts of the world much more than others. But the reason why we need to talk about climate justice and not just climate change as that rather technical environmental issue, which is kind of what has been addressed for the past 3 decades, at least at the level of that international regime, is that we also need to talk about what happens to people on a daily basis, not just the emergencies. Obviously, the emergencies need to be addressed, and they're also the way to help us understand how bad the situation is. But maybe just to take one example, climate change is also falling water tables in Rajasthan, or actually anywhere else in the country, but it's more severe in places that are already dry. It's people having, or particularly women, having to travel far from their house to get water, which is increasingly of worse quality, because the further down you go with the groundwater level table, the more likely you are to get water which is not drinkable. So just that is a reason for talking about climate justice, because it's the injustices which come out, the injustices that already exist and that have already been faced by people, which become much worse and very fast in a way. And clearly, despite the amount of policy talk of action, because it's not like there's no action or government action taking place, governments are just not able to catch up with the pace at which climate change is wrecking people's life.
Wonderful. Philippe, you mentioned the principle, and this is something that I wanted to bring up in our conversation. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change does mention a very key principle, which is common but differentiated responsibilities. And somewhere, this hints at the inequalities between nations as well when it comes to climate change. Could you both tell us what these inequalities are at that level, but also go deeper down, as both of you have mentioned? We must also then look at regional and local networks as well. Could you tell us what are these inequalities, just for people to understand better that fighting climate change can't be the same for everyone? Everyone has very different problems to fight when they're talking about climate change at their own levels.
Okay, so maybe I'll start with the framing of the principle, and then Roopa can follow up. I guess the first thing to say about that is that principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, as it's framed in the context of the climate change regime, is essentially the way in which equity or justice was meant to be reflected at the international level in terms of the climate change regime. Now, what this is supposed to do, it's not supposed to deal with all relevant issues. It's really about acknowledging the difference between, at the time as they were known, developed and developing countries, but we usually now know more as the global south and the global north. But the idea is the same, and apart from a few countries which may have kind of moved between categories, it's still very much the same group of countries that we're talking about. So in the first place, that justice or equity dimension that the principle wants to reflect is about the different contributions to the problem. And by 1990, which is the baseline which is used in the convention, it was very clear that the global north, developed countries, were overwhelmingly responsible for climate change. So there was no question that there should be a difference between the kind of commitments that the two different groups of states should take. In the meantime, there's been some change, at least for some countries, particularly the BRICS countries, China leading the pack probably, but all the BRICS countries, whose contribution to greenhouse gas emission has increased tremendously. But beyond that, the basic distinction between particularly least developed countries, the majority of small developing countries, and the global north has remained a huge gap, which needs to be addressed in terms of equity, and that's where the principle is supposed to be.
Yes, and to add to it, I think the distributional effects of climate change, there is a disproportionate burden that is actually borne by the poor and the marginalized and in countries where they've really not contributed to the problem. So the issue then is about how do you ensure it's not just about mitigation, but there is also an adaptation issue that needs to be brought in. And the adaptation concerns really are about building capacities. In most of these countries, institutions are weak, governance mechanisms are weak. So how do we ensure that both of these, in terms of capacity building, in terms of building climate resilient institutions and governance frameworks, along with the financial support and the technological support that these countries would need in addressing climate issues.
The situation of India and let's say the Maldives. Maldives country slated to be submerged by climate change, virtually no contribution to the problem globally, or even if there's been minimal contribution locally. And here it's not just suffering the consequences of climate change, it's a country that might be or will be wiped out at some point in the future. So we are talking about completely different situations, different contributions, different capabilities in terms of addressing the problem. And that's something that this principle has not been able to do well until now. It's not that the problem is not the principle itself, it's a way in which it's been framed in policy making, where for convenience sake, we've just decided to say that there is developed and developing countries and we won't go beyond that.
I was about to ask you guys, I mean, there's also another level of inequality in the, in the power to decide on solutions and the power to be holding conversations. How does that shape climate justice and the need for climate justice? Especially, Philippe, you said Maldives. So smaller island countries have been for a while trying all kinds of ways to raise more awareness about their plight. Can we speak about them in the context of the limited power that they have to shape the discourse?
Small countries have less of an impact on global policy making. Now, in principle, that's not what we would expect, because that international system, and that's the way in which the climate change regime is also built, tells us that each country is equal to any other country. So the Maldives is equal to India and the US, or whatever may be the case. So in practice, we know that that's not the case, but the problem is that the way in which decision making happens, typically it's that rule of one state, one vote, if there is a vote which is taken at all, means that in principle, these small countries should actually have a significant voice in the system. But in practice, they don't, partly because often in those international negotiations, there won't be a vote which is taken, which means that to build a consensus, you need to build a consensus that will suit the bigger powers that are in the room. And that's often how the bigger powers manage to frame the consensus on behalf of the so-called international community. So that's one first level at which these countries suffer in that sense from the existing system.
It is a matter of concern, participation and transparency and how decisions are being made. Is the decision-making process entirely fair and just? That's a question mark, because geopolitics certainly has a say in how the negotiations finally shape out.
Actually, that takes us to another dimension, which I guess we need to come back at some point in the conversation. Otherwise, we're only looking at the state-based system, which is that indeed movements are crucial. But what's interesting is that we may not understand that if we focus only on the term climate justice. Very often, the movements are not focused on climate, but that's because climate is, in a way, the sum of so many other environment and social issues. So each movement may be fighting for something which looks much smaller than climate change, but in fact, these are all building blocks of that biggest thing that we'll call climate change. And there is no way in which we can understand climate change or climate justice without disintegrating the issues into smaller things. So just to give one example, it could be the displacement that is caused by dams being built to produce hydropower, because that's a clean form of energy to replace fossil fuels. It could be the displacement from lands or forests, for either forests which are going to be maintained or trees that are going to be planted in the name of carbon sequestration. So these are things which could be taken as being either natural resource or environmental issues at a very local level, but in fact, in many cases, either indirectly or directly, as in the case of these forest plantations, for instance, often it's directly part of the global regime. They very much relate to what we're talking about here in terms of climate justice.
One of the things that I wanted to understand, and I think might be interesting for people who are listening to the podcast to also understand, is just who is responsible for ensuring climate justice. What is this climate change regime that we talk about? How do some of these frameworks work? Because Kyoto has been in popular discourse for a while, and so has the Paris Agreement. But how do you see these agreements, and now, of course, the Glasgow Pact? How do you see these agreements really taking shape? Have they been successful in delivering climate justice? Has it even been on the agenda for these agreements in these multilateral forums, or have they, do you think, failed in doing that?
Good starting point, because one of the problems, at least that I see with that climate change regime, is that since 1992, the world, or whoever is interested in the issue, has been obsessed with greenhouse gas emissions. As a result of which is fine, that's the way in which to understand climate change as a global issue. But as a result of which, the actual debates that take place concern strategies of economic development, because whatever you do in terms of greenhouse gas emissions impacts on your existing strategy or path of economic development. So in the name of discussing an environmental issue, the biggest environmental issue that we're supposed to be facing today, very often the debate actually focuses on very narrow economic interest of individual states. And one of the problems we have, and which maybe explain why is that.
In responding to that question, I think one needs to look at this from the broader legal framework. So there is the 1992 UN Framework Convention. It's a treaty-based law which was adopted, and it includes the 1997 Kyoto Protocol and then the 2015 Paris Agreement. Other than that, of course, there is the IPCC reports, which are scientific reports, which give us a broad understanding of what is happening within the scientific field, which kind of backs up the issues that one is discussing around climate change. Now, within the climate change regime itself, the climate change law, we are looking at four basic issues. One is, of course, mitigation, the mitigation of climate change. How do we actually limit and prevent being one aspect. There is the adaptation issue around climate change, which is to limit the harmful effects that one is seeing. And then, of course, there is the issue of how do we actually provide the financial means to support the mitigation and adaptation aspects of it. And then an international oversight, which the Framework Convention actually provides in ensuring the implementation and compliance is taken care of. So that's the broad framework within which one is talking about the changes. Now, up to the Kyoto Protocol, we see that there is a focus on mitigation, very specifically on setting targets and setting timelines. Post that, we're seeing a change or rather an evolution in the framework itself, in how they approach the law and policy measures. So while the initial effort was essentially to do a top-down approach, the present Paris Agreement attempts to do a more hybrid model of getting the countries to actually sign up to what they think is a fair and ambitious nationally determined contribution. So there is a change, there is a shift, and it's debatable whether this is a dilution or whether this allows for all countries to actually get involved and help solve the climate change issue.
So we have a little bit of justice concerns, whatever they may have been and however effective, that remain and that carries through the regime. Now, eventually in 2014, I hope I'm right on the year, there was an agreement between the US and China in terms of how to move forward with that principle. And the agreement was essentially to dilute it. As far as I'm concerned, some people see it as taking it forward in terms of allowing for more flexibility, which was to say that we will still believe in that principle of North-South equity, but we will do it on the basis of individual circumstances of different countries. And essentially what this means, which is what Roopa was mentioning before, each country can decide what it is that they feel they need to do in terms of addressing climate change. Now, the big letdown here is that however difficult the negotiations may have been in the mid-1990s towards that Kyoto Protocol, there was a common agreement to do something, so that kind of reflected that idea of the global issue of climate change. And then something needs to be done by only one specific group of country at that point, because it's agreed that they're the ones who've contributed most to the problem. The UN General Assembly admonishes its own member states, so it's the same entities we're talking about, for having taken pledges which are insufficient to even meet the commitments made under the Paris Agreement.
Philippe, you mentioned 2015 Paris. A lot has now changed, Roopa, Philippe, both since Paris, and obviously the climate justice movement has only grown stronger. We've now seen that discourse around climate justice and climate change is now very mainstream. Even in countries like India, we've got newspapers which are covering climate change as as a subject by itself, which was not the case, till say 5 years ago. For instance, if I have to talk about journalism. Do you think this increased awareness, this increased activism around climate justice, has it percolated into multilateral forums? Did we see any of that being reflected last year at Glasgow, or do we see that there is still a huge gap between the movement and the climate change regime and how it looks at the issue of climate justice?
We are hearing a lot more about climate change. I'm not so sure whether we can equate hearing more about climate change with hearing more about climate justice. And that, again, first of all, if it's policymakers, most of them probably don't think they're working towards climate justice. Their topic is something different. The ones dealing with fundamental rights or human rights, maybe the ones who think that their understanding of climate change is in terms of climate justice. I'm not sure that their voice is that visible or that much more visible, or that in policy-making terms, they have that much more visibility than they had. A little bit, obviously, because, again, until the mid-2000s, there was very little in terms of people, in terms of the individual or community-related justice in terms of climate change. There's a lot more of that that's come. People are much more involved as a result also, because before, I guess, climate change was seen much more as that technical thing which concerned the big people sitting in those meeting rooms somewhere, whether in the capital city of a country or in Bonn, New York, or elsewhere. So now that has definitely changed. People feel that they can have a stake in the way in which we can address things, whether from a local level. So it may be called climate, it may be called something else, but it addresses climate change, or in terms of that broader climate change justice movement.
And one more impact of the greater, of both the movements and the greater awareness is the spread of climate litigation over the last decade. So there is now an effort at trying to take some of these into the courts, to try and see if the courts can push the governments to meet their obligations. So that is a positive too.
Whether people call it climate justice, whether the world call it climate justice or not, there is a lot more understanding of the issues that need to be addressed, a lot more interest in doing something. And it may be in terms of local issues. Let's say North India, NCR, Jenny North India, people understand air pollution as a big issue at this point, at least for some months of the year. They may not relate that to climate change. Maybe that would be what policymakers will do at some other level, but it's the same issue we're talking about at the end of the day. So it may be that this is something which doesn't come on the radar of climate justice, because it's seen as a local issue in that sense, local to regional issue, but it's very much part of the broader conversation that we're having. And I'm sure that there'll be hundreds of thousands of similar examples of different things happening, which are actually part of that conversation, but which may just not be labeled as climate change.
Countries like India have often chided the global north for not doing enough. And one aspect of that is climate funding, for instance. We've now got enough data to show that the global north has failed in meeting some of the funding goals that they'd set. How is the lack of climate justice really affecting nations and really affecting those at the very grassroots in helping fight climate change? It'll be interesting to sort of translate that into very real world effects on the ground. That I feel like might be a nice way to sum the conversation up as well. So if you can just tell me how is the lack of climate justice sort of affecting things on the ground?
I think a very simple example is what has happened with the heat wave this year in Delhi, for instance, in large parts of northern India. And how does this really impact informal workers and people who live in tin sheds, in slums, informal settlements? The impact of this is so severe that it's not just about health related, but the inability to actually carry forward your livelihood. A street vendor is not able to stand in the heat and sell his wares. Someone who works from a home is unable to stay indoors and continue to work for many hours. Will need a different kind of a space to actually operate out of. So there are real concerns. These are real concerns. And if you're looking at urban floods, what is happening with flooding all across, how does this impact everyday lives? So these are real everyday issues that will need a policy shift and a policy change. So we're seeing right now people actually putting in place disaster management plans that take into effect climate-related concerns. So we're now looking at, say, heat action plans or flood action plans being thought of at the local level. So the translation of the climate change discourse into a climate justice framework will need a collective participation. It will need the media to bring awareness. It will need local governments which have governance institutions that are familiar with the topic of climate change and its impacts. And it will need political will to actually work with the issues that we are facing. So it's a complex set of approaches that will have to be knit together to make an effective response at the local level.
Wonderful. Thank you so much again. Thank you, Philippe. Thank you, Roopa. Thank you so much, both of you. Thank you for listening to this podcast. In the next episode, I interview Dr. Loveleen Bhullar, a lecturer at the Birmingham Law School, to find out why climate equity is so important when fighting climate change. This podcast was supported by a grant from the British Council.